Hi everyone, Aaron Mate joins us today, a journalist, author, and political commentator with The Gray Zone, and to discuss, I guess, the holes which are being
You too, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
across the NATO countries now. There's a certain panic in the air as we lost the war in Ukraine, but it also some of the panic appears to stem from the also that the narrative that we have been told over the past 3 years has also been proven to be full of holes. And to a large extent, this has also been a war of narratives over the past few years. And I think one of the latest holes in the narrative was with this New York Times article, which came out recently, outlining the extent to which the United States had been leading the war in out of Germany. What do you make of this article, though? Or how significant is it?
Well, the article just fleshed out what you and I have been saying for a long time, which is that the US was behind this war and was using Ukraine to bleed Russia to the point where US military leaders were literally planning Ukrainian military operations and directing their strikes from a military base in Germany. Uh, and there's just some funny details about it. So, for example, we learned that because the US didn't want to admit publicly that it was selecting targets for Ukraine to hit, they just changed the name targets to points of interest. So technically, they could get away with lying to the public and saying, we're not taking part in targeting Russia because in their planning, they didn't call the targets targets. They called them points of interest. That's the kind of semantic deception that had to be undertaken in order to wage a proxy war from Germany against Russia. And we learned that even after US officials assessed that the risk of Russia using a nuclear weapon had dramatically increased, they still kept going. They didn't change their strategy really at all. Um, and they authorized weapon systems, escalating weapon systems, despite not being sure how Russia would respond, including not being sure that Russia wouldn't hit NATO troops. So essentially, they were the ones moving their own red lines. Contrary to what we constantly heard about Putin, has all these red lines and it's okay to cross them. No, it was actually our red lines that kept moving. And they did so relying on actually Putin and Russia to be restrained. So there's another aspect of the rhetoric, of the public rhetoric being undermined, because the whole time we kept hearing Putin's a madman. If we don't stop him here, he's going to go on to the rest of Europe and maybe the rest of the world. Actually, the whole time they were relying on Putin to be restrained as the US, and they're continuously surpassed their own red lines. And then, of course, there's a lot of narrative management here to basically blame the Ukrainians for any failures. So every time there's a failure in the article, it's always the Ukrainians' fault because they didn't follow the US advice, they didn't stick to the plan. There's no responsibility whatsoever. The only hint at responsibility comes from the fact that they acknowledge, as was publicly known, that General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top US military leader, said that Ukraine could not win the war because Russia was just too big. And they ignored that advice. And they ignored Mark Milley when he called for diplomacy back in October 2022. That's the only sort of gesture toward acknowledging that there was some dissension inside the US ranks and there was some awareness that Ukraine couldn't win. Otherwise, the article says basically, to whatever extent Ukraine lost, it's their fault, not ours.
Yeah, well, there were some articles coming out earlier. I think about 2 years ago, you had the Washington Post also writing about the summer offensive of 2023. Well, no, that was a year and a half ago, anyways. And the main argument there was also that the Ukrainians were too risk averse, I think was the word they
That's right.
used, and
Yeah.
they didn't. And a lot of them, the military leadership, were opposing it while they were pressured by the United States. Kind of begs the question, though, when does this cross from being a proxy war to a direct war? When especially with some of these weapon systems, if the United States is directly involved, we haven't really had a serious discussion about this, I think.
Yeah, Alexander Mercouris makes the point that he doesn't use the term proxy war anymore. He calls this a coalition war, just because of the extent of the involvement of the NATO coalition, particularly the US. And yeah, literally, if you have the US choosing targets, overseeing the firing, giving Ukraine the coordinates. Literally, I mean, that's the impression of my article, is that basically Ukraine did not use these long-range weapons, these weapon systems, without U.S. approval and without U.S. coordinates. So in that case, the distinction between Ukraine and the U.S. is really meaningless. It's the U.S. directly targeting Russian forces. It's just Ukraine that might be pushing an actual button or manning the system, but otherwise it's all the U.S. So yeah, maybe even the term proxy war isn't adequate at this point. Maybe direct war, coalition war
Yeah, well,
is more appropriate.
yeah, because if you plan the war, you select the targets, you supply the weapons, and on top of it, with a lot of these long-range weapons, they actually have to be managed by American soldiers as well. There's suddenly no role at all for the Ukrainians. This is starting to seem more and more like a direct war. But there's also, yeah, a recent issue was that with Boris Johnson, because in which he argued, yeah, a few weeks ago that yeah, the nationalists didn't permit Zelensky to essentially implement his peace mandate, because he was elected in 2019 on a peace mandate, winning 73% of the votes to implement the Minsk agreement, make peace with Donbass, or at least open dialogue and make peace with the Russians. And yeah, I made the argument as well that, well, since 2019, that he was pressured to reverse, well, the democratic mandate he had to make peace. But I was told that the nationalist narrative was Russian propaganda. We shouldn't repeat this, but is this what is the significance here? Do you see does it actually have any impact? Do you see the narrative shifting, or do we just continue with the same storylines in the media?
Well, in terms of the impact on the narrative, no, it doesn't, because we just have such an obedient media system in which some facts can't be acknowledged. So even Boris Johnson acknowledging, as you said, that it was the Ukrainian ultranationalists, the extremists, who stood in the way of implementing the Minsk Accords, that doesn't matter. It just doesn't register. I mean, we pointed this. I mean, we shared the clip of Boris Johnson. It's, you know, it goes out to our circles, our niche circles, but otherwise it just doesn't land because it's inconvenient to the narrative. But what's funny about Boris Johnson admitting that is that, you know, he's Zelensky's biggest foreign cheerleader. You know, he's really sung Zelensky's praises because Zelensky's essentially followed his orders. But what was Boris Johnson doing in saying that? It was the ultranationalists who sabotaged Zelensky's peace mandate. He was undercutting the main argument that Zelensky made in the Oval Office to J.D. Vance when he told J.D. Vance, what kind of diplomacy are you talking about, after J.D. Vance advocated diplomacy. And what Zelensky said to J.D. Vance was, listen, I tried to make a deal with Putin. And he invoked the agreement that Zelensky signed with Putin in Paris in December 2019, in which there were supposed to be prisoner exchanges and there were supposed to be steps towards implementing the Minsk Accords. And Zelensky said Putin didn't follow any of it. So basically, Zelensky was trying to say that Putin had sabotaged their agreement that they signed together back in December 2019. And therefore, I can't make an agreement with him. Well, Boris Johnson comes out and says a few weeks later, yeah, actually, it was the ultranationalists inside Ukraine that prevented Zelensky from implementing the compromise because they opposed the compromise. And what was the compromise? It was respecting the Minsk Accords, respecting autonomy for ethnic Russians inside of Ukraine, which they refuse to do because they don't see these ethnic Russians as equal Ukrainians, and they don't even want them in their country. So Boris Johnson made that admission at a very, very inconvenient time for Zelensky.